The silence of the dungeon was not merely the absence of sound, it was a kind of scream the soul learned to give without using the voice. Inside, the darkness was so thick it seemed to have weight. The cold, damp stone walls held the echoes of every punishment inflicted on enslaved people who dared to disobey, escape, or simply fall ill. The air smelled of mold, blood, and fear. Those who entered rarely saw daylight again. Built beneath the slave quarters or in the basements of the manor houses, the dungeons were the very heart of colonial terror. They served not only to punish, but to teach others the price of defiance. The overseer, with his merciless eyes and whip in hand, was the judge, the executioner, and the living symbol of power. Every chain fixed to the walls told a story time tried to erase, but memory endures, like a flame hidden beneath the ashes. The nights were the worst. The scraping of iron against the floor, the muffled groans, the rats fighting over scraps of food. No clock marked the hours inside. Time was measured by pain. Some enslaved people stayed for days, others for weeks, and some never left. And when the heavy wooden doors finally opened, the body might leave, but the spirit remained trapped in that eternal darkness. In the slave-holding society, the dungeon was seen as something natural, part of the routine. The manor needed fear to maintain order, and the dungeon was the perfect instrument. Masters and mistresses knew that when night fell, the screams from the slave quarters served as a warning. Yet they slept peacefully, as if suffering were just a distant noise. That was how the system of slavery survived, through the sound of chains, the shadow of punishment, and the silence imposed by pain. But not all silence was submission. Some learned to hold inside what they could not scream. In those depths, the first sparks of resistance were born. A glance, a gesture, a whispered word. It was hope trying to breathe between fear and death. The dungeon was the grave of many, but also the womb that gave birth to an invisible force, the will to be free. As years went by, the dungeon became more than just a cell. It became a symbol, a mirror of Brazilian society itself, where a few lived in the light while many were condemned to darkness. That stone structure hidden underground represented what Brazil tried to conceal, that the foundation of its power was built on human suffering. On some plantations, there was more than one dungeon. One for those who fled, another for those who rebelled, and yet another for the women who resisted the master's violence. They were punished in silence, and no one dared to look. The overseer knew that fear was more efficient than the whip. Psychological terror kept the chains tighter than iron ever could. Foreign travelers who visited Brazil in the 19th century described these places with horror. They wrote of piled bodies, marks on the walls, dried blood on the floor, and yet the elite claimed it was necessary. Slavery turned human beings into tools, and when the tool broke, the dungeon was the repair shop. But something moved in the shadows. Even there, where life seemed to end, songs were born. Soft chants murmured to chase away despair, prayers mixed with African dialects, fragments of memory that resisted forgetting. Music was the only way to scream without being punished. Each note echoed as a whisper of hope through the frozen walls. With time, the dungeon became more than an instrument of punishment. It became a metaphor. The dungeon was also inside the slave quarters, in the mind, in the laws, in the religion that denied black humanity. The entire country was one great dungeon, light for the few, darkness for the many. And even after the Golden Law, the chains changed form but never truly disappeared. Archaeologists excavating old plantations have found remnants of chains and human bones beneath the slave quarters, proof that not all punishments ended with forgiveness. Many died and were buried right there, without a name, without a cross, without a story. But today, by speaking of them, each word restores a little dignity to what silence tried to erase. And this is where the question must be asked. Why was this part of history hidden for so long? Why does the country that built its empire on slavery still hesitate to face what happened in those dungeons? Perhaps because the echo of those screams still lives today, in the prisons, in the favelas, in the voices silenced by violence and racism. The past was never just the past. It repeats itself, only changing its address. Now imagine for a moment if those walls could speak. If every scratch upon them told the name of someone who suffered there, would you have the courage to listen? Because what comes next are not just stories, they are voices. Voices that were never heard, but still echo among us. Yet there was something even more terrible than the darkness. What happened when the silence was finally broken? And that's what you are about to discover now. There were moments when the dungeon seemed to breathe, not with the air of the living, but with the stifled murmurs of those who once believed they might still leave. Between the damp walls, the sound of a dripping drop of water marked the passing of a world that had forgotten its prisoners. Each drop was a reminder, another day alive, or another day dead while living. The voices that echoed in the dark never made it into the history books. They belonged to enslaved men and women dragged from the slave quarters and taken underground for trivial reasons. A defiant look, a misplaced word, a stolen scrap of food from the manor kitchen. The overseer decided, and no one questioned him. There, punishment was not only physical, it was a method of erasure. Pain was calculated, silence was taught. Some cried until their voices broke. Others learned to breathe silently so as not to be heard. Some whispered prayers, blending African words with Catholic prayers they were forced to learn. That mix of faith was the final refuge for those whose bodies could no longer bear the pain. The dungeon was the place where faith stopped being belief and became survival. Foreign travelers who visited colonial Brazil left disturbing accounts. One described the unbearable stench rising from an opening in the ground, the entrance to a dungeon. He wrote, "I heard voices that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. They were not screams, but whispers of those who had already given up." Those words still echo today as testimony to a pain the world chose to ignore. In the slave quarters, the others knew what it meant to be taken to the dungeon. No one spoke of it, but everyone understood. Fear sustained obedience. At night, the sounds rising from the underground traveled with the wind, mingling with the sad songs of crickets and the crackling of branches. And even in silence, everyone understood the message. Do not dare to resist. But within every human being lies something even iron cannot break. Even in the depths of darkness, some kept a small invisible flame alive. The memory of a mother left behind in Africa, the face of a child born in the slave quarters, a promise made to the old gods. These small memories were like sparks that together would one day ignite the fire of rebellion. The women suffered even more cruelly. Many were taken to the dungeon not only as punishment, but for daring to say no to the master. Violated, silenced, forgotten. Their bodies became the ground for punishment and power. Some lost their minds, others their lives. Yet there were those who, even amid pain, found strength to care for others. They whispered songs in languages the masters did not understand, to comfort those beside them. That was their way to resist, turning pain into shelter. Over time, the dungeon became part of the colonial landscape, and society began to pretend it didn't exist. While church bells rang on Sundays, while the mistresses of the manor prayed for their souls, the underground remained filled with voices pleading for mercy. The contrast between faith and cruelty was one of the greatest ironies of that era, as if God had two faces, one for the whites and another, silent, for the blacks. There are records of enslaved people who left the dungeon alive, but they were never the same. The sunlight, meant to be liberating, burned their eyes. Many lost their sense of time, of place, even of themselves. The punishment was so deep, it stripped them of identity. That was how the system worked. Destroy a person's sense of self so that no one else would dare see themselves as human. But not all silence was defeat. Some carried every detail inside them, waiting for the right moment to speak. Decades later, long after slavery was abolished, the children and grandchildren of those survivors still told stories that always began the same way. My grandfather was locked in a hole and came back different. That was how memory stayed alive, passed from mouth to mouth, from soul to soul, without depending on the books written by whites. Perhaps the most remarkable thing was how the dungeon managed to turn fear into unity. Inside it, men and women who had once come from different African nations began to recognize themselves as equals. Pain unified them. Shared suffering became a language. And little by little, a consciousness was born, one the masters could never comprehend, that freedom was not a favor, but a right. In some regions, certain dungeons were so old that their foundations blended with those of the churches above them. A cruel irony. Over the pain of the enslaved, temples were built where forgiveness and love for one's neighbor were preached. Perhaps that is why the silence of these places feels so heavy, because it carries the hypocrisy of a nation that built its faith upon the suffering of others. The echoes of those screams still live on, even if invisible. They are in Afro-Brazilian music, in dances of resistance, in the religions born from the mixture of pain and faith. The drumming heard in popular celebrations is not just joy, it's also remembrance. It's the sound of voices that were once silenced, and that today, disguised as rhythm, continue telling the story of those who were never allowed to speak. And, curiously, the silence once taught in the dungeon became the same social silence that centuries later would conceal racism. The inheritance lies not only in erased names, but in the nation's inability to hear the cries coming from the outskirts, from the prisons, from the streets. Even today, silence is used as a tool of control. And if we listen closely, we'll realize that the sound of the dungeon never truly stopped. It only changed its tone. Some say that at night, in the ruins of old plantations, faint voices can still be heard, like long prayers rising from the earth. The locals call it the breath of the enslaved. It's the wind passing through the cracks of the old cells, producing a sound that resembles a lament. Perhaps it's only the wind, or perhaps it's history refusing to be forgotten. The voices that no one heard never truly went silent. They were merely smothered by time, by fear, by the convenience of those who profited from silence. But the truth is that no pain disappears on its own. It transforms, and one day, that transformation finds a way, a chant, a drumbeat, a cry. And when those voices began to unite, something changed forever. Silence became a code, lament turned into song, and darkness gave way to a new kind of strength. Because the dungeon could imprison the body, but never the soul, some decided they would rather die fighting than live in silence. And it was in the depths of those very shadows that the first signs of resistance were born. What they did that night changed everything. They used to say the dungeon was the end of everything, but for some, it was the beginning. The beginning of a rebellion that was not born from screams or swords, but from glances, gestures, and rhythmic beats on the ground. A rebellion made of silence, the same silence the masters mistook for submission. Within those damp walls, fear began to transform into something new, courage. It was nighttime when the change began. The overseer, tired, had left his club leaning in the corner. Inside, the enslaved knew that no one watched so late. The only sounds were the dragging of chains and the heavy breathing of dozens of bodies trapped in the dark. Then one of them, a man named Tamba, began tapping his foot against the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4 slow beats. Another answered, knocking on the wall. A secret code born from despair. It was the first communication between prisoners in weeks. The beats turned into rhythm, the rhythm into song, and the song, though almost inaudible, spread through the cells. It was a sound that mixed pain with hope. No one knew the exact words, but everyone understood the meaning. We are still alive. It was the most dangerous cry they could give, and the most liberating. The overseer noticed nothing that night, but soon the masters began to suspect something. The slave quarters were quieter than usual. No one cried aloud. No one begged. Fear seemed to have changed sides, and the silence, once a sign of submission, began to unsettle those in power. The colonial order had always depended on noise, the crack of the whip, the screams, the public humiliation. When everything grew too quiet, the manor house knew something was about to happen. Historians call this phenomenon passive rebellion, but for those who lived it, there was nothing passive about it. It was a war of the soul. The enslaved began sabotaging tools, delaying work, hiding food, pretending obedience. Every small act was a blow against the system. The dungeon, which was meant to destroy, had instead united. And then there was the power of music. The masters believed the African songs were merely for distraction. They didn't know they carried messages. When drums were allowed, they transmitted disguised instructions. One beat meant danger, another meant escape, another called for secret gatherings. That was how they organized. Under the disguise of melody, the same sound that whites heard with indifference became the code of freedom. Many of those meetings happened at night, in the woods near the plantation. Men and women who had known the terror of the dungeon gathered around small fires, praying and planning. The flames illuminated scarred faces and determined eyes. They knew that any escape attempt almost always meant death. But after knowing what was inside the dungeon, dying trying no longer seemed the worst fate. The silent rebellion also spread among the elders, those who no longer had the strength to run, but still carried the will to teach. They passed down secrets, how to read the sky, how to follow the stars, how to use the wind and the sounds of animals to find their way. It was ancestral wisdom crossing the ocean and blooming again on Brazilian soil. Every lesson taught was a strike against oblivion. Some masters began to realize that something was slipping from their control. Punishments grew harsher, chains heavier, but nothing stopped what had already begun. The dungeon was no longer just a prison. It had become a symbol, and symbols are things no chain can hold. On many plantations, enslaved people began carrying small stones or pieces of iron as amulets. They said they represented the keys to the dungeon, a reminder that freedom still existed, even if only in thought. The strength of faith grew alongside the will to resist. In the slave quarters, secret ceremonies began to emerge. Men and women gathered to sing, dance, and call upon their ancestors. There, in the heart of the night, spirituality became resistance. The religion imposed by the masters blended with the beliefs brought from Africa, creating a new form of faith, one that freed, that healed, that united. The drums that echoed through the forests were both prayers and declarations of war. One of those nights, Tamba, the same man who had begun the rhythm in the dungeon, led an escape. It was a new moon. Shadows covered the sugarcane fields. He and 8 companions broke their chains and ran in absolute silence. They used the paths taught by the elders, avoiding guards and dogs. It said they crossed rivers, swamps, and dense forests until reaching a high region, where they founded what would become one of the first maroon refugees. The news spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. The impossible had happened. A group of enslaved people had survived an escape. Hope was reignited. Others tried to follow the same path. Many died, but the idea of freedom could no longer be erased. And every time another group fled, the masters built more dungeons, as if stones and chains could contain a dream. Over time, the fear the masters felt began to turn into paranoia. They no longer knew whom to trust. The kitchen slaves could be hiding messages in the food. The men in the mills could be sabotaging the machines. Even the children were viewed with suspicion. The manor house trembled, and it wasn't from cold. Some priests who witnessed slavery began to question the system. They denounced the brutal punishments, the dungeons, the tortures. But they were silenced, accused of sowing discord. The truth was that the entire economy of Brazil depended on slavery. Breaking the chains meant breaking the nation, and no one was willing to lose the profit for which so many had died. But the silence persisted, and the more they tried to suffocate it, the stronger it grew. The rebellion was no longer confined to the slave quarters, but had reached the cities, the ports, the ships. Enslaved workers in the streets began spreading information, planning group escapes, organizing support networks. The maroon communities grew hidden in forests and mountains, fed by that silent current that united all who suffered. The dungeon, once a symbol of fear, had now become the symbol of resistance. Everyone who survived it emerged changed, carrying something the masters would never understand, the certainty that the human spirit cannot be broken forever. The darkness that once tried to kill hope had become the very place where it was reborn. And then, when silence had spread everywhere, something happened. In several regions of the country, masters began to disappear. Entire plantations were found empty at dawn, gates open, chains broken. No one knew exactly what had happened during the night, but rumors spread. They said it was the spirits of the dungeons returning to seek justice. It was fear changing hands. The silent rebellion needed no leaders, no weapons, no shouts. It lived in every gaze that refused to bow, in every step that refused to stop. It was a war fought within the soul, where victory meant surviving and keeping alive the memory of what had been lost. And so, in the shadows, the empire began to crumble, not by decree, but by the exhaustion of the system itself. Slavery sustained the nation, but it was doomed to fall, because no one can silence an entire people forever. The silent rebellion was the beginning of everything. It was the most powerful sound in the history of Brazil, the sound of those who could not speak, but still made the world listen. But the silence had not yet ended. When the slave quarters finally grew still, the master of the manor began to feel the fear that once belonged to others. And what came next changed everyone's destiny. As silence deepened in the slave quarters and the whispers of rebellion spread, the manor house became a fortress of paranoia. The windows that once opened to the garden were now locked. The laughter of parties was replaced by listening ears and watchful eyes. Fear, once a weapon, was beginning to change sides. The masters no longer slept in peace. They felt their control over bodies remained intact, but their control over souls was slipping away through the cracks of the night. The manor house was the center of power, the stage of hypocrisy. There, the same man who ordered a slave to be whipped before lunch knelt before a crucifix after dessert. The white walls hid more sin than any slave quarter. And it was precisely in that environment that terror became institutionalized, when fear became a tool of governance. Each lash was not just punishment, it was a public reminder of who ruled. The masters knew that the dungeon alone wasn't enough. Punishment had to become a spectacle. So they began holding public whippings. The overseer gathered the enslaved, and the sound of leather slicing through air served as a sermon. The children watched. The women cried. The men lowered their heads. With every blow, the manor reaffirmed its sovereignty, a sovereignty built upon wounded flesh. Historical records tell that in many plantations, the overseer kept a list of examples of the weak, enslaved people accused of trying to flee, of rebellion, of speaking too much. They were punished under the sun, before everyone, while the master watched from the balcony with a glass of wine in hand. Cruelty became routine, and blood part of the landscape. That was how the system kept its machinery running, through constant terror and the promise of more pain. But the more fear was used, the less it worked. Punishments multiplied, but so did silence. The masters began to notice something was wrong. They no longer saw terror in the eyes of the punished. They saw something else, resignation, and nothing frightens an oppressor more than someone who is no longer afraid. To try to regain control, the manor turned to religion. Priests and missionaries were invited to preach to the enslaved about obedience and divine punishment. They quoted the Bible to justify slavery. "Servants, obey your masters." It was the gospel of fear, twisted and used as an invisible chain. The same Christ who preached love was turned into an instrument of submission. Some enslaved people pretended to believe, crossing their arms and bowing their heads. But at night, in the slave quarters, they told a different story. They sang about a God who liberated, about a Christ who suffered with them. They turned the symbol of pain into strength. And so, even without knowing it, they planted the seeds of a faith the manor would never understand. A faith that does not kneel before those who oppress. Terror, however, went beyond physical punishment. Humiliation was an even crueler form of torture. Enslaved people were forced to wear iron masks, collars, bells around their necks. Each instrument had a purpose: to dehumanize, to make suffering visible so others would learn. The overseer called it a lesson. The manor, satisfied, called it order. The sounds of these instruments of punishment echoed across the plantation: the clinking of bells, the dragging of chains, the muffled groans. The noise of pain was music to power. The louder the suffering, the safer the manor felt. It was a cruel choreography, and every lash was a rehearsed step to maintain control. But something was changing. The gaze of the enslaved was no longer the same. Terror no longer bred submission, it bred hatred. A silent, deep hatred that built up like a storm, ready to break. The manor didn't see it, but it was digging its own grave. The masters tried to modernize punishment. They created surveillance systems, foremen patrolling among workers, spies hidden among the enslaved, collective punishments for those who didn't report fugitives. With every escape, more chains. With every death, more whips. Fear became currency, and power, an illusion that had to be proven every single day. On some plantations, the terror was so extreme that even the overseers lost their minds. There are records of suicides, men tormented by the screams they heard at night. Guilt, even when buried deep, always found a way out. Because evil, when repeated for too long, begins to devour the one who practices it. Deep down, the manor house knew this. That's why it hid behind tall walls, locked windows, and luxurious parties. Every ball, every song, every toast was an attempt to drown out reality. The empire of sugar, gold, and coffee, everything shone on the outside, but rotted from within. The colony's glory was built upon the horror of the dungeons. Fear then began to turn against the masters themselves. Rumors spread that the spirits of dead enslaved people returned to haunt the plantations, that chains dragged by themselves, that doors slammed at night, that screams echoed from the underground. Many believed the dungeons were cursed, and perhaps they were, not by magic, but by memory. There was something the masters never understood. Suffering doesn't disappear. It lingers in the walls, in the floor, in the air. Every tear shed inside a dungeon was a seed of justice planted in the earth. And one day, those seeds would sprout, not as vengeance, but as awareness. With time, the empire of terror began to crack. News of uprisings and maroon communities spread. The masters pretended not to be afraid, but they trembled. Newspapers began publishing reports of insubordination, mass escapes, and strange movements among the blacks. The fear that once controlled had become the fear of losing control. And amid it all, a new kind of master began to appear, one who realized the system was doomed but didn't know how to live without it. Guilt and greed waged war inside these men. They wanted slavery to end, but they feared losing power. So they kept the game going, prolonging the pain in the name of stability. The manor house was, in the end, a gilded prison. Its owners were prisoners of the very fear they had created. They didn't realize the whip no longer worked, that silence no longer obeyed, that the dungeon had become a symbol of resistance. The terror that once was their greatest ally had turned into their ghost. In the still of the night, as candles burned low, some masters heard drums in the distance. They thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was the silent rebellion growing. It was the sound of the earth vibrating, of chains breaking, of voices preparing to speak. Terror as control was losing control. And when fear changes sides, history changes with it. But fear, no matter how strong, never defeats hope. And it was in the forests, far from the eyes of the manor, that this hope became freedom, the birth of the Quilombos. Freedom began as a whisper, a name spoken in secret, a prayer murmured, a plan born among the shadows of the slave quarters. It was the dream of breathing without fear, of seeing the sun without chains, of hearing one's own name without being called property. For many enslaved people, escape was a death sentence, but dying trying was better than living in silence. The Quilombos were born from that contained scream. They didn't appear all at once, nor in a single place. Each one was the result of the courage of men and women who dared to defy the system. They fled in small groups at night, guided by stars and memory. They walked barefoot, hidden by rivers, trails, and dense forests. They carried almost nothing: a bit of food, a piece of iron, a song in their minds. They carried the essential, the will to exist. At first, they were few. But as the terror of the manor intensified, more enslaved people joined those hidden communities. They called them Quilombos, Mocambos, or refugees. They were small villages built by fugitives, raised in inaccessible places, protected by the forest and by faith. There, for the first time, those who had been treated as merchandise became people again. Life in the Quilombos was hard, but it was free. There were no masters, no overseers, no dungeons. There was work, solidarity, and resistance. Those who arrived were welcomed, fed, and taught how to survive. They shared the little they had. They planted cassava, hunted, fished, and built houses from clay and straw. At night, they gathered around the fire to tell stories of Africa, stories that captivity had tried to erase, but that were reborn with every word spoken. In many of these Quilombos, women played a central role. They were healers, midwives, counselors, and leaders. They carried ancestral wisdom and the strength of motherhood. Some, like Aqualtune, grandmother of Zumbi dos Palmares, had been princesses in their native lands. Others, once ordinary enslaved women, transformed trauma into power. Within the Quilombos, they taught their children to walk without fear and their men to fight with dignity. The most famous of all was the Quilombo of Palmares. Located in the Serra da Barriga in Alagoas, it survived for nearly 100 years, an eternity for that time. Palmares was not merely a refuge, it was a nation. It had laws, organization, agriculture, an army, and leadership. It was governed with respect and collective purpose. Zumbi, its most celebrated leader, represented more than a man. He was the symbol of the freedom Brazil refused to recognize. But Palmares was not alone. There were hundreds of other Quilombos scattered across the land, in Minas Gerais, along the rivers, in Maranhão, hidden in the valleys, in the mountains of Bahia, and even near cities, camouflaged in plantations and abandoned mills. Each was a spark. Together, they formed a wildfire of resistance that no army could completely extinguish. The Quilombos were more than shelters. They were laboratories of humanity. There, the formerly enslaved recreated Africa within Brazil. They blended languages, religions, dances, flavors, and beliefs. New forms of art, faith, and politics were born. The drum, which had once echoed in the dungeons as lament, now beat as celebration. It was the sound of survival. Each beat a reminder that despite pain, the human spirit is unbreakable. But freedom has enemies. The colonial authorities saw the Quilombos as a direct threat to order. For the masters, each escape meant loss. The empire could not allow black men and women to live freely. It would mean admitting that slavery was a lie. So began the campaigns of destruction. Armed troops invaded the forests, burned houses, captured fugitives. It was a silent war, fought far from the city's eyes, but filled with blood and courage. Even in the face of violence, the Quilombos rebuilt themselves. With each attack, a new group would rise. When Palmares was destroyed, dozens of others were born. Freedom could not be extinguished by fire. It spread like smoke. There was something the empire never understood. The Quilombo was not a place. It was a spirit, a state of consciousness, a secret code passed from generation to generation. That spirit crossed the centuries. Even after abolition, when Brazil pretended to grant freedom, the Quilombo remained alive, in the tenements, in the favelas, in the outskirts. In every community where black people unite to survive, the Quilombola spirit breathes. It is the same flame that once burned in the forests and now burns in the streets, in schools, in music, in the fight for dignity. There is something sacred in the idea of the Quilombo, because it represents the opposite of the dungeon. The dungeon was the place where light died, the Quilombo, where light was reborn. One was prison, the other liberation. One was silence, the other song. And between these two extremes lies the entire history of black people in Brazil, a journey from darkness to hope. The oral testimonies of Quilombo descendants tell of nights filled with song and dance, where bodies once marked by the whip became instruments of joy again. They speak of weddings, births, initiation rituals. They speak of justice and of the pride of being able to call oneself free. In the Quilombos, children learned that fear was not inheritance. They learned to look at the sky and read the stars, to listen to the wind and know the way. They learned that freedom was more than escape. It was living without bowing one's head. It was a kind of knowledge Brazil had yet to understand, how to exist outside the logic of the manner. But freedom came at a high price. The attacks were constant. Many leaders were betrayed, killed, or captured. The heads of some were displayed in public squares as warnings. But even that couldn't stop the dream. Because every slain leader became legend, and every legend gave courage to others. Zumbi was killed, but his name never died. He became the cry of a people who learned to turn pain into strength. Over time, the government realized that no matter how many expeditions it sent or dungeons it built, the Quilombo could not be erased. Freedom had become an idea, and ideas are indestructible. The centuries passed, but the spirit endured. It manifests in every act of black resistance. It lives in samba, in candomblé, in capoeira, in the fight for equality. It lives in every black woman who rises early to sustain her family, in every young person who claims a place in the university, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. Because the Quilombo is more than the past. It is the present. And as long as injustice, racism, and inequality exist, the Quilombo will continue to exist, reinvented, resistant, reborn. The spirit of freedom was never a gift. It was a conquest. And that conquest began the moment the first enslaved person looked to the horizon and decided never to turn back. But not everyone who escaped found refuge. Some were hunted down, captured, and brought back. And what the empire did to them was worse than death. It was the return to the dungeon, the return to hell. To return was worse than dying. For those enslaved who managed to flee but were later recaptured, the way back was not only physical, it was a descent into hell itself. Their hands bound, bodies wounded, feet dragging through the road. The overseer rode behind them on horseback, whip slung over his shoulder, eyes feeding on fear. With each step, the fugitive knew what awaited: the dungeon, the same place they had sworn never to see again. Those who returned were not taken directly to the slave quarters. First came the ritual of humiliation. They were tied to posts in the center of the plantation courtyard for all to see. The other enslaved people were forced to watch, men, women, and children, as if another's suffering were a lesson. The silence was heavier than the screams. No one dared cry, because even a tear could be seen as defiance. The punishment began with the sound of the whip cutting through the air. It was a dry, metallic sound, almost ritualistic. The first strike tore the skin, the second, the soul, and the third ensured everyone remembered. The overseer counted the lashes aloud as if reciting a perverse psalm. 10, 20, 50, sometimes 100, sometimes until the body collapsed. And when it did, the punishment didn't end. It only changed form. It became contempt. Some masters ordered that fugitives be branded with hot iron. They burned letters into their chests, backs, and faces. F for fugitive, R for rebel. It was the seal of captivity, a warning that this body no longer belonged to itself. Others forced them to wear iron masks, preventing them from eating, speaking, or even crying. The pain was a constant reminder that the power of the manor house was absolute. Or at least, that's what they believed. But amid such cruelty, there was something the masters could not control. Every public punishment, instead of extinguishing the spirit of resistance, ignited another silent flame in the slave quarters. Every strike was a reminder that freedom was worth any price. The blood spilled in the courtyard mixed with the earth, and that earth would one day demand its due. Those who survived being brought back were rarely the same. Many lost their speech, others their sanity. Some went blind, others were left crippled. But all carried in their eyes an undeniable truth. They had tasted freedom, even if only for a brief moment. And anyone who has tasted freedom even for a day can never again fit inside chains. Travelers who passed through the colonies recorded scenes of horror. One wrote, horrified, that he had seen a black man tied to the whipping post, his body covered in wounds, his face silent. He asked the overseer why the man did not scream. The overseer replied, because he is no longer afraid. Those words, preserved in an old diary, are the perfect portrait of an empire that lost its humanity, and of a people who, even in agony, never lost their dignity. Captured women suffered even more. Beyond physical punishment, they were subjected to sexual abuse as a form of control. The female body became a battlefield. Violated in front of others, many were forced to bear the children of their abusers. Children born without a father, without a name, without freedom. Some in despair took their own lives, others escaped again, taking their children with them, even knowing they might not survive the journey. It was the purest form of courage, the courage to die, trying to protect what little remained of themselves. In some cases, masters ordered fugitives to be executed in public squares. It was exemplary justice. Cities filled with onlookers, white men, elite women, priests, and children watched as if it were entertainment. The hanging black body served as a reminder that order was being preserved. But in the shadows, others watched differently, with the eyes of the enslaved, who saw not death but sacrifice. And deep within every heart was born a promise. One day it will be different. The few who escaped death and returned to the dungeon became legends. Within the slave quarters, their names were whispered with reverence. They were treated as warriors, martyrs, examples. Slavery tried to turn them into warnings. The black people turned them into symbols. That's how memory survived. And that's how the empire lost control, because no amount of violence can erase a story passed from generation to generation. The cruelty was so immense that even some overseers began to question their own sanity. Historical accounts tell of nights when they heard screams coming from nowhere. They said it was the echo of the souls who had died in the dungeons, wandering the plantations. Many, tormented by guilt, went mad. Some took their own lives, others fled, and others sought forgiveness in churches that had themselves remained silent before injustice. But the empire knew no mercy. The system was larger than the individuals. The economy depended on slavery, and the punishment of fugitives was part of its machinery. Suffering was a commodity, necessary, profitable, and systematic. And to preserve profit, fear had to be maintained. That is why the return of survivors was always turned into spectacle. Newspapers of the time described these executions as acts of discipline. They called the enslaved disturbers of order, troublemakers, insolent. But between the cold lines of those reports hid an uncomfortable truth. Brazil was afraid of losing control, afraid of black uprising, afraid of facing its own reflection. Yet there was something no one could foresee. The accumulated suffering was becoming awareness. The children of the punished began to realize that fear was an inherited prison, and that to break it, they had to remember. Thus were born the first storytellers, the guardians of memory. They repeated the names of the dead, told what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. Every word was a brick in the construction of resistance, and that resistance, though silent, began to spread. In the slave quarters, new forms of communication appeared, hymns disguised as prayers, orations that carried messages, rosaries that hid plans. The overseer didn't understand, but the people did. What began as a whisper in the dungeon now echoed everywhere. The return of the survivors, therefore, was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase. They returned wounded, yes, but carrying something far more powerful, proof that the system was not invincible. They returned with stories. And stories are weapons. A word spoken at the right moment can free more than any key. These survivors, even mutilated, began teaching others how to plan escapes, map routes, and organize groups. Many became spiritual leaders, healers, prophets. They said they spoke with their ancestors, and perhaps they did, because there are pains so deep they can only be understood between worlds. And so, while the empire believed it was strengthening fear, it was unknowingly feeding the very movement that would destroy it. Suffering created awareness, pain created memory, and memory created strength. Every punished body became a remembrance, and every remembrance became resistance. And it was in the slave quarters, in the nights of prayers and drumming, that this resistance began to find its voice, a voice the empire could no longer silence. The dungeon, which once served to suppress, now served as witness. The walls that had heard groans now kept secrets. The masters thought they had won, but they did not know that the voices of the dead still spoke through the living. And that was how slavery began to rot from within, not by the power of weapons, but by the power of truth. The truth that no punishment could erase, but not everyone was willing to wait for the end. Some chose to fight, not with swords, but with faith. And in the slave quarters, in the sound of the drums and the night prayers, a new kind of strength was born, the strength of hope. At the end of the day, when the overseer retreated to the manor house, another kind of life began in the depths of the slave quarters. It was when the silence of fear turned into song. Soft beats on the dirt floor set the rhythm. Calloused hands followed the cadence, and the voices, low and trembling, rose like prayers. No one dared call it music, but it was. And more than music, it was survival. Faith was the last refuge no one could take away. When everything was forbidden, the body, the name, the word, only the invisible remained. The enslaved mixed what they remembered of African religions with what they had learned from priests and missionaries. It was a syncretism born from pain, a meeting between the God of the whites and the gods of the blacks. In the slave quarters, Jesus was brother to the Oryxars, and Mary, the mother of all who wept in silence. The manna viewed such devotion with contempt. The masters thought it was superstition. But in the slave quarters, faith was something else. It was strength. It was the only space where the enslaved could feel human again. Prayer became resistance. Each chant was a way of saying, "We are still here." On nights of full moon, when the sky was clear and the wind soft, the sound of drums carried for miles. The overseers tried to stop it, but the more they forbade it, the louder the people sang. They sang to chase away fear, to heal the body, to remember the dead. They sang to remind themselves that there was life beyond pain. Those songs were coded messages. They spoke of saints, but also of escape. They spoke of heaven, but also of freedom. Every word had two meanings, one for the oppressor, another for the oppressed. It was the language of faith disguised as submission, and for that very reason, indestructible. Over time, the slave quarters became temples, not temples of stone, but of soul. The enslaved created their own rituals, their own forms of worship. African prayers blended with the Catholic rosary. The names of the Oryxars were replaced with those of saints to deceive the masters. Iansa became St. Barbara, Ogum became St. George, Oxum became Our Lady of the Conception. But behind the names, the spirits knew who they were. Women were the guardians of that faith. While the men were punished in the fields, they kept the flame of spirituality alive. They were healers, blessers, priestesses. They prepared herbs, performed blessings, and taught their children to pray. In their hands, the sacred became medicine, protection, and courage. Some were killed for it, others survived and passed on the gift, keeping alive a tradition that would last for centuries. The song also became a weapon. During work, the enslaved sang repetitive melodies. The overseer thought it was distraction, but in truth, it was communication. The songs carried stories, instructions, and coded messages. Some warned of escapes, others of punishments, others simply eased the pain. It was a cry disguised as melody. Those chants would later give birth to entire cultural expressions: samba, capoeira, maracatu, jongo. Each rhythm born from suffering became a way to rewrite history. Music transformed the lash into art, the cry into verse, the pain into dance. Brazil, without realizing it, was shaped by the sound of those it tried to silence. But there was something deeper than rhythm. There was faith in an unseen future. Even without knowing how to read or write, the enslaved believed in promises. They spoke of a time when all would be free, of a day when the chains would fall. They called that time tomorrow, and tomorrow became a prayer. Every sunrise was a small victory over the night before. The masters could not understand how hope still existed. They could not comprehend how a people beaten every day could still sing. But the secret was in the soul. Slavery could wound the body, but it never learned how to kill the spirit. Some priests with more sensitive hearts noticed this. They wrote in their diaries that the black people had a faith that overflowed from within, a faith that did not come from books but from experience, a faith that did not ask for permission. It was a faith born of resistance, not of fear. With time, that faith began to threaten the system. The drumming and prayers brought dozens together, and in them, ideas of freedom were born. The overseer grew suspicious. He ordered the gathering stopped, banned drums, threatened with the whip. But when he slept, the drumbeat returned, because there are sounds even oppression cannot silence. On the darkest nights, when the wind passed through the cracks of the slave quarters, many believed they could hear the voices of those who had already gone. They said they were the ancestors, the spirits of those who died in the dungeon. They came to bring courage, comfort, and direction. To the oppressor, it was superstition. To the oppressed, inheritance. Those visions created a new awareness that suffering was not in vain. The enslaved began to believe their pain had a purpose, that they were paying a high price for something greater, something divine. That belief gave meaning to resistance, and little by little, faith became fear's greatest enemy. Even the cruelest punishments could not extinguish the flame of hope. After the beatings, many returned to the slave quarters and sang softly, thankful just to still be alive. The overseer thought it was submission, but it wasn't. It was defiance. It was the soul saying, "You can wound my body, but you will never have my voice." The children born into slavery grew up hearing those songs. They learned that freedom begins inside each person. They learned that even when the whole world says no, the heart can still say yes. And so, with faith and music, the black people survived the impossible. Faith, song, and hope turned the slave quarters into an invisible sanctuary. There, where pain was supposed to win, spiritual resistance was born. There, where silence was supposed to reign, music was born. There, where fear was supposed to rule, courage was born. And when freedom finally arrived, even if late, even if false, the drum kept playing. It no longer played for survival, but for memory. Each beat was a remembrance of those who came before, those who resisted, those who believed. Music became prayer, and prayer became history. And that's why even today, when the drum sounds in a samba circle, at a street festival, or in a torero, there's something sacred in that rhythm. Because within it lives the echo of the slave quarters, the echo of the dungeons, the echo of the faith that sustained a people when the world tried to destroy them. Faith was the shelter, song the weapon, and hope the miracle. But when hope began to bloom, the empire decided to tear it out by the roots. And what came next was the cruelest blow of all: false freedom. The abolition that freed without restoring life. On May 13th, 1888, the bells rang. The streets filled with people, and the newspapers announced the end of slavery. Brazil celebrated what it called the Day of Freedom. But in the slave quarters, the sound of the bells didn't mean the same. For those who had lived their entire lives in chains, there was no celebration, only silence. Because the freedom written on paper was just another empty promise. The signing of the Golden Law took only a few seconds. The suffering it claimed to end had lasted more than 300 years. And when the princess signed the document with a smile, the bodies that had built the empire remained wounded, starving, and directionless. No compensation, no land, no home. Freedom arrived like someone opening the door of a burning house and shouting for everyone to run, without shelter, without direction, without anything. Abolition was a carefully rehearsed play. The politicians wanted to clean the country's image before the world, but never intended to change its structure. It was necessary to appear modern, civilized, humanitarian. But one only had to look at the streets to see the truth. Freed blacks sleeping under bridges, begging at church doors, working for crumbs on the same plantations they once fled. The system changed its name, but not its essence. The slave quarters became tenements. The overseer became a foreman, the whipping post became a prison, and the manor house became a company. Slavery merely changed clothes. The masters were compensated for their losses. The enslaved were not. They were thrown to their fate, as if freedom itself were enough. But freedom without land, without education, and without rights is only a new kind of prison. Many returned to the plantations out of desperation, accepting miserable work in exchange for food. Others migrated to the cities and formed the first black neighborhoods, places forgotten by the state, where poverty took root and never left. There was born what we now call inequality. The country pretended to liberate, but in truth, merely reorganized captivity. Newspapers from that time showed black people wandering the streets with bundles on their backs. Some were hunted down, accused of vagrancy. The same country that had enslaved them now criminalized them for existing. New laws appeared against vagrants, beggars, the idle. New words for an old control. The whip was replaced by handcuffs, the slave quarters by the cell. And meanwhile, Princess Isabel was called the Redeemer, the white woman who freed the blacks. But no one asked the freed if they felt free. They already knew the answer. Freedom without reparation is abandonment. Abolition was not the end of slavery. It was the beginning of exclusion. The empire washed its hands, abandoned its people to misery, and called it progress. Modern Brazil was born on this deception. Landowners, resentful of the end of forced labor, began importing European immigrants. Italians, Germans, and Spaniards were brought with promises of land and salary. To the blacks, nothing. Institutional racism was created, a society where the color of one's skin determined who would have opportunity and who would remain chained, now invisibly. This new form of slavery disguised itself as capitalism. The same hand that once held the whip now signed contracts. The black body continued to serve, only without visible chains, and the elite convinced itself that the problem was solved. But the black people knew true freedom had not yet arrived. The songs that once spoke of escape now spoke of survival. The drums changed their tone, the prayers changed their address, and hope began to live on the margins, in the quilombos that survived, in the favelas that emerged, in the voices that refused to be silenced. Brazil moved forward as someone who walks over their own wounds. It built avenues over old slave cemeteries, raised monuments to white heroes and forgot the real ones. In schools, the golden law was taught as victory, not as farce. And so the nation learned to lie to itself, calling freedom what was still imprisonment. The black people remained the mirror Brazil refused to face. Because to look at them meant confronting what we truly are, a nation that never freed itself from its past. The chains of the 19th century turned into the statistics of the 21st. Overcrowded prisons, overpopulated favelas, low wages, disposable lives. The dungeon changed its address, but it never disappeared. And yet, even amid injustice, faith endured. The same faith that sustained those who sang in the slave quarters now sustains those who fight in the streets. The hope born in the Quilombo forests now marches through the avenues. The black people learned to turn every blow into rhythm, every tear into a word, every pain into resistance. Abolition, after all, never ended. It's still happening. True freedom is a process, not a date. And as long as there is one humiliated black man, one forgotten black woman, one black child without a future, May 13th will remain only a reminder of how far we still have to go. The farce of freedom is not just history. It lives today within the same structures that insist on repeating the past. But there is something time could not erase, awakened consciousness, because the people once silenced now speak, and their voice echoes louder than the princess's bells. The silence of the dungeon seemed to have ended, but in modern prisons, in the alleys and the favelas, the echo still lives. The name changed. Now they call it the system, but the sound is the same. The dungeon merely changed its address. They say Brazil abolished slavery more than a century ago. But just look around to see that the dungeon was never destroyed, only rebuilt elsewhere. Today it's called a prison, it's called a favela, it's called an unemployment line, it's called a statistic. The country that freed the enslaved without giving them land, work, or dignity created a new kind of prison, invisible but just as cruel as the iron chains. The slave quarters became the slums, built on hillsides and mangroves, where the state rarely arrives and where hope must be reinvented every day. The dungeon walls were replaced by walls of concrete and social barriers, and the silence of the captives now echoes in the silence of the forgotten. In Brazilian prisons, the color of the cells remains the same. More than 60% of prisoners are black or mixed race. Most are young, poor, without lawyers, without a voice. Chains became handcuffs, whipping posts became bars. The logic is the same: punish first, understand later, or never. The penal system is the direct heir of the overseer. Only the uniform has changed. The favelas, in turn, are the new quilombos, but without the right to freedom. They are territories of resistance and abandonment. There, the people build with their own hands what the state refuses to offer: housing, food, schools, dignity. And still, they are treated as enemies. When the police climb the hill, they look with the same eyes as those who once invaded the quilombos, the eyes that see threat where there is only survival. Poverty in Brazil has a color, incarceration has a color, death has a color, and that color is the direct inheritance of the chains history pretended to break. The statistics are the modern mirror of the dungeon, cold numbers that hide entire lives. Behind every percentage, there's a face, a story, a family. But the country has learned to turn pain into data, suffering into reports. It's easier to count bodies than to repair centuries of injustice. The schools of the periphery are often the new corridors of the slave quarters. Overcrowded classrooms, lack of materials, absence of future. Meanwhile, the universities still mirror the manor house. White, elitist, inaccessible. The descendants of the enslaved still knock at the door of history, asking for what was promised over a century ago: opportunity. And the answer is still silence. But silence, as we know, is never empty. It carries memory. And in every favela, in every cell, in every body marked by inequality, there are old echoes, the same ones from the dungeon. Modern Brazil talks about meritocracy, but forgets there can be no merit when some are born free and others are born handcuffed by their skin color. The statistics are merciless. They show that the average income of black workers is nearly half that of white workers. They show that black women are the most exploited, the ones who work the most and earn the least. They show that a young black man is twice as likely to die before the age of 25, and still the country insists that the past is behind us. But the past never passed. It just changed address and ID number. The modern dungeon also lives in the mind. Racism no longer needs chains to imprison. It shows up in glances, in denied opportunities, in doors that never open. It's in companies, in universities, on TV shows, in disguised jokes, in absences. Society created new forms of exclusion, more subtle, but just as cruel, because racism in Brazil has learned how to smile. But there's one fundamental difference between the old dungeon and the new one. This time, the voices are not silent. They speak, write, sing, denounce. The black people have learned to use words as weapons. Memory has become a shield, education, a trench, and art, the cry that echoes where once there was only pain. The drums that once marked the rhythm of the slave quarters now beat in the favelas, in the samba schools, in the street protests. The song Born in Darkness now fills stages, books, and screens. The faith that sustained the enslaved now sustains a new generation of fighters. They carry the same blood, the same strength, the same hope, and they know that true abolition hasn't happened yet. But it will. The modern dungeon is maintained by invisible structures: lack of access to healthcare, negligence in public policy, institutional racism. Every absence is a new chain, every neglect a new punishment. But as in the past, there is resistance in communities, in churches, in samba circles, in classrooms, in collectives. The spirit of the Quilombo remains alive, reinvented, urban, digital, but alive. The system tries to silence, but history has learned to scream by other means. The internet has become the new drum. Through it, the voices once erased now unite, organize, and recognize themselves. The descendants of the dungeons have discovered that memory is the greatest weapon against forgetting. And every time someone tells this story, another chain breaks. Brazil still lives between two worlds, one that pretends to be free and another that still fights to exist. But this time, there's something different. The people are no longer alone. The truth has left the shadows and taken the stage. And the more the country tries to hide, the louder the echo of the past becomes. The modern dungeon may disguise itself as the prison system, as social inequality, as statistics, but it remains the same. A place built to silence what makes people uncomfortable. And as in the past, silence is the cruelest form of violence. Only now there is a crucial difference. The voices once silenced have learned to turn silence into a cry. And that cry travels through generations, breaking through time and history. It says, "We survived, and because of that we will win." But the story does not end here. Because one day the dungeon will be only a memory, and the silence that once killed will become the sound of victory. But for that to happen, someone must dare to speak. And that is exactly what will happen in the final chapter. For centuries, silence was the language of pain. The dungeon, the slave quarters, the whipping post, all were temples of silence. But there is something time could not bury. The voice that resisted even when there was no mouth left to speak it. The voice that crossed generations, hidden in songs, in tears and in prayers. The voice that now finally rises to tell what the world pretended not to hear. Silence was the system's most powerful weapon. It erased names, distorted stories, destroyed identities. But no lie lasts forever, and what was once silenced returns to speak. It returns as song, as art, as awareness. It returns as a drum that beats, as a word that heals, as a truth that frees. Every person who speaks of the past today is, in some way, breaking down the dungeon's walls. Every story told is a chain breaking. Every name remembered is a light shining in the depths of history. Because memory is the antidote to forgetting, and forgetting is the cruelest form of death. For too long, black people were taught to be ashamed of their own history. They were told it was past, that it was better to forget. But those who forget their scars are condemned to repeat them. That's why speaking is resisting, and resisting is living. The voice that now echoes doesn't belong to one. It belongs to millions. It is the voice of the women who were violated, yet still created life. It is the voice of the men who died in chains yet kept their heads high. It is the voice of the children who inherited the pain and the strength. It is the voice of the quilombos, the terreiros, the favelas, the streets, the classrooms, the prisons. It is the voice of the Brazil that survived its own silence. This voice doesn't ask for permission. It demands space. It doesn't speak only of the past. It speaks of now, of tomorrow, of what still must be done. Because racism isn't an old memory. It's an open wound. And healing will only come when the truth is spoken, heard, and felt. The sound of this voice isn't one of revolt, it's one of awareness. It doesn't shout for vengeance, but for justice. It doesn't ask for pity, but for respect. It doesn't seek charity, but reparation. And when it speaks, the whole world must fall silent to listen. The descendants of the dungeon were not born for silence. They were born to tell the story, to turn trauma into teaching, pain into art, memory into liberation. They are living proof that the impossible is only what has not yet been tried. Today, the drum that once wept for the captive now beats in celebration. Each beat is a name recovered. Each rhythm, a cry of victory. The same pulse that once guided escapes now guides awareness. The same song that once begged for freedom now celebrates existence. The dungeon still lives in statistics, in prisons, in inequality. But now it also lives in books, in films, in voices that refuse to be forgotten. The difference is that this time, the storyteller is not the master. It's the survivor. And when the survivor speaks, the truth changes hands. The voice that breaks the silence is more than sound. It's healing. It heals the wounded soul of a people. It heals the body of a nation sickened by denial. It heals time itself, giving it meaning again. Because when time listens to truth, it reconciles with life. Today, the echo of the dungeons travels through generations. It lives in schools that teach what was once hidden. It lives in songs that retell what was once silenced. It lives in faces that look forward, but carry in their eyes the weight and pride of history. And perhaps this is the greatest victory of all. The people who were once forbidden to speak are now the keepers of the word. And the word is power. With it, we rebuild the past, heal the present, and transform the future. The silence that once killed now serves as a frame for the sound of resistance, and each time a black voice rises in this country, the dungeon trembles a little more. Because forgetting fears the truth, and truth, when spoken, has the power of 1,000 drums. The dungeon was built to erase lives, but it created the opposite, a people capable of turning pain into light, a people who made darkness into an altar and suffering into a song, a people who learned that freedom is not a gift, it's a daily conquest. And so the cycle closes. The story that began in silence ends in voice. The cell built to suppress now echoes with words, and the world, finally, is forced to listen. The silence of the dungeon was never the end. It was the beginning. Because every time someone remembers, every time someone speaks, every time someone refuses to forget, the dungeon fades a little more. May this voice continue to echo. May it inspire, teach, and awaken. Because the true cry of freedom does not come from the mouth, it comes from memory. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video. Help more people hear what the world tried to silence, because the truth can no longer be buried.